All right, guys, welcome out. Thank you for taking the time to listen. As always, make sure you like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. And we're going to keep going with Ezekiel part 3. And I'm not actually sure where I left off, to be totally honest with you. I think that it was around chapter 13. And I was talking about the false prophets who prophesy from their own imagination, basically, the dangers of that. And there's a lot to be said about that. You're misusing the name of God when you do that. You're acting from your own selfish ambitions and inclinations. You are, it's a very corrupt thing to do. And especially when in this context, he's pronouncing judgment upon the people who are, on the people in general who are engaged in debaucherous behavior and all kinds of murder and idolatry and all this other stuff. But he's also specifically calling out the leaders of this, the people that kind of affirm it, the prophets that make up prophecies, the people that just say, oh, yeah, God said to do this. And he said that we'll be blessed and we don't have to worry and all this other stuff. And it's fine doing what you're doing. And also the prophets that do this for money. They're not doing it for God. They're doing it insisting that they be paid, basically. And so I think I did talk about it, but I want to touch on it again real quick. In chapter 13, verse 10, he talks about, where he says, these evil prophets deceive my people by saying all is peaceful when there is no peace at all. It's as if the people have built a flimsy wall, and these prophets are trying to reinforce it by covering it with whitewash. And so I think that the reason I want to touch on this is because I see it happening in modern society, which a lot of Ezekiel I see happening in modern culture is very relevant to what's going on today. You see these kind of ridiculous ideas and philosophies that are being pushed around, and people trying to say that this is of God because it makes sense to them in their heads, because there's some core tenet within these philosophies that is centered around some sort of virtue a lot of times. Like maybe, I mean, obviously, like you're not going to get very far saying this is how we should do things when it's obviously destructive. Even though these things are obviously destructive, but they're kind of camouflaged behind these veils of illusion that make them look good. Like they're dressed up in nice clothes of like, well, this is love, this is acceptance, this is, it could be protection of this group, or it could be this of these individuals. Maybe for example, they make them feel better about themselves when in reality they should be being criticized and pointed out and said, like, actually, what you're doing is wrong. Like, you shouldn't be made to feel better about what you're doing. And the idea of building a flimsy wall and trying to whitewash it, I like that imagery a lot, because, we all do this where we justify what we do. We decide I want to live a certain way. I want to adopt this certain mindset, philosophy, whatever. And then we build structures psychologically, culturally, to kind of protect that. And we reinforce it with things that are not really that useful or not really that real or tangible. And we try to cover up all the mistakes in it, all the gaps in the wall, all of the weaknesses of it by just like kind of brushing over it, pushing it under the rug, that sort of thing. And he's specifically kind of laying into people that are lying in the name of God, basically. And the false prophets in particular. We're going to read another verse. He says, you have discouraged the righteous with your lies, but I didn't want them to be sad. And you have encouraged the wicked by promising them life, even though they continue in their sins. So the idea of you're berating the people that are actually doing the right thing. You're beating those people down, the ones that are actually following God, the ones that are actually trying to stay on the right path. And then you're encouraging the ones who are willfully going the wrong way, who are intentionally setting themselves in alignment with, wickedness, with debauchery, with darkness. And again, you see that a lot in culture. Like, what is affirmed? It's never virtue. It's never morality. It's never the good. It's never the actual foundation upon which we should be building our lives. It's always a substitute. It's always things that allow people to get away with living however they want. under the guise of tolerance, acceptance, race, politeness, whatever else. And yeah, I think that that's really interesting, because when you're doing that, you're violating one of the 10 commandments. I can't remember off the top of my head which one it is. I probably should, but the one that says, you do not use the name of the Lord in vain. And part of what that means is like, yeah, don't misuse God's name. But and what it translates to originally, I believe, was don't carry the name of the Lord in vain. So when you use the name of God to justify your behaviors or to gain power for yourself, you're corrupting, you're bringing a high level of corruption into something that is holy and that should remain that way. And it's going to remain that way regardless of what you do to it. But your use of it is, despicable. And so you see, like, for example, when you hear about these people that talk about their religious trauma as kids, and I think most of that is kind of nonsense, to be perfectly honest with you. But there is something to be said if you were, like actually mistreated by people of the faith who are professing the faith anyway, that can become a huge barrier for you developing a relationship with God, because it's understandable. It's not acceptable, but it's understandable why you would get focused on, well, this person said that, God wanted them to shame me and make me feel bad or to hurt me, to do these to actually objectively bad things to me. And so like, it's understandable why people would not want any part of that. Now, again, that is focusing on the people. It's not focusing on God. It doesn't say anything about who he is. It says something about who those people are. And then also the other side of that too, what I would point out is that most of the people that are deconstructing and are talking about their quote religious trauma are complaining about very silly things. They're complaining about, like, you ask them like, what was the trauma? What was it? And it's usually like, oh, I felt guilty for doing things. Like, you should, like, you're supposed to feel guilt. That's a good thing, because it tells you that you could do better and that you're doing something wrong. And can that be misplaced? Yeah, absolutely. But usually when you actually question these people, and like obviously it does happen where we beat ourselves up more than we need to, or we beat other people up more than we should. That does happen, routinely, because we're imperfect, we're human. But most of the things that people are complaining about as like, this was like a huge deal breaker for me, it's like, well, what was it? I don't get to live life however I want. I don't get to behave according to my desires. And it's like, well, that's kind of ridiculous. That's obviously a very juvenile approach. But when you actually do bear the name of God falsely and in vain, and you discourage people from following the path, and you encourage people who are intentionally rejecting it, that it creates a barrier of entry. It also corrupts the word, or what is an attempt to corrupt the word of God. And so it's a very serious thing. It's not to be taken lightly. And I think that modern Christians would do very well to understand that you can't compromise what God has said. You can't adjust it to fit into culture. You can't adjust it just because you think, well, this sounds kind of harsh, or, well, God's all about love, so that means that everything's going to go well. That's not actually quite what the text says. The reality is that we have to deal with the consequences of our actions, and that if we do bad things are going to happen to us. It may not be immediate, and it may not be in the way that we would expect it to be, but we have to answer for that. And to encourage people and say that no, you get a free pass. That's not what it's all about. Like, don't worry about the law and stuff like that. It's all about forgiveness. Like, yeah, like forgiveness is a huge part of it. But one of the themes that you see over and over again in the prophets, in all of the Bible, but especially I think in the prophets, is that there's this sense of, hey, you've gotten away with this stuff for a long time, and that's going to stop very soon. And the only way to stop you is through pain, because that's discipline. That is the essence of correction. Because if God first will say, hey, stop doing these things. But if you don't listen, if you insist on going further and further down that downward spiral, well, at some point there has to be corrective action. There has to be something that actually puts up a firm boundary and stops you. And it's for your own good, right? Like, these are not arbitrary rules. If you're allowed to just prosper as you continue to do evil, then you degrade to unbelievable extents. And I think I've mentioned this before. I kind of thought as a kid reading the prophets, like, there's no way that they were doing all of this stuff. Like, that's just too extreme. And now I look around in real time and it's like, oh, actually, this is exactly what's happening. And that's why I wanted to do Ezekiel, because I think it's very relevant to what's going on today. So he goes on to say in chapter 14, in this way, the people of Israel will learn not to stray from me, polluting themselves with sin. They will be my people, and I will be their God. I, the sovereign Lord, have spoken. And so that's exactly kind of what I was pointing out. The fire and brimstone kind of thing, the wrath and all that, like the anger, the discipline. It's not because like we've offended God and we've hurt his feelings. It's because that is what keeps us on track. Like he wants what's best for us. And if we don't listen to, the nice way of things, we have to be punished at some point. Just like if you have a kid, like you have to punish that kid at some point. And obviously you don't want to do that. You don't want to be wrathful all the time. But if you are not capable of being wrathful, then nobody respects you. If you're not capable of setting firm boundaries and enforcing them, then you can't actually be forgiving and merciful. Because if all you can do is forgive and be merciful, well, then that's not actually mercy. That's just your inability to do anything else. And so what God is saying again and again in these prophets is that, like, look, he wants to be merciful. That's what he wants. That is what he will choose. And he will give us opportunity after opportunity to turn back, to do better. He doesn't expect perfection, but he does expect genuine effort. He expects us to try. And when we don't do that, it's not just that he doesn't like it, it's that it's really bad for us. Because the ultimate good for us is to reach back up to the transcendent, to be reunited with the divine. And we can't do that when we're willfully moving away. And so the best thing for us is to follow God's law, even if it doesn't make sense, because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it seems as though it's oppressive and it's arbitrary and whatever. But that's how anything that makes us grow feels while we're going through it. It's never pleasant. It's never fun. It's never enjoyable. And it's always contrary to our nature. Otherwise, we would just do it intrinsically, but we don't, because that's not the way that we are kind of developed. Like we have a very self-destructive bend to us. And when we're allowed to entertain that and to just indulge in it, it's probably the right word. And then we take it to an extreme. And not everybody, not all the time, but certainly you see people do this. You see people act this out. Maybe drug addiction is a good example of that, where somebody indulges that desire to such an extent that they become unrecognizable as a person. But you see that analogy apply to culture, to societies, where, for example, in the West right now, we've had a long period of prosperity and peace, and nothing really too terrible has happened to us in a long time. And without anything external or even internal really to like really shake us up, we create chaos amongst ourselves, and we get so fixated on life is good, life is easy, I can just pursue pleasure endlessly. Whereas if we were struggling for survival, we would kind of forget about a lot of that stuff. We would find pleasure again in like the small things and say, I don't know, community. But instead we have to, we get bored. There's nothing to do. Like we don't have any wars to fight. I'm not saying that would be a good thing, but I'm just pointing out that because there is nothing really serious that we're dealing with, we create those problems for ourselves. It goes on to say, they wouldn't obey my regulations, even though obedience would have given them life, reinforcing the idea that these are not arbitrary rules. These are not oppressive rules. These are what we need to be the best versions of ourselves. This is the pattern that we have to follow if we want to grow as spiritual beings and to overcome our earthly nature. And if anybody denies that they have self-destructive tendencies and that they're not really in control of themselves and they don't really understand themselves and they're at war with themselves, well, then they're silly. They're lying to themselves, probably. We struggle with our own animal nature. We struggle with our earthly inclinations constantly. There's no getting away from that. And so when we don't have a structure, when we don't have something to say, look, here's the clear black and white, this is right, this is wrong, do this, don't do that kind of thing. When we don't have that, we're left to make it up for ourselves based off of what we think is best. And our thinking is fallible. Our emotions are unpredictable and transient and chaotic. And so are we. We're very emotional creatures. And the primal side of us, the body, for example, is an animal. It really is. It's not, it's thinking, but it's not intelligent. It has an intelligence to it in a sense, but it wants its own things, right? Like I want to look a certain way, yet my body wants to eat a certain way. You know, I want to be perceived as by people as being nice, but I certainly have issues regarding anger and pride and all this other stuff. And so like I want to do the right thing, but there's also that impulse that keeps me from doing that. And what is that? And well, that's what we're struggling against. And it's a very real thing. It's a very physical thing, but it's also a very metaphysical thing. And so the regulations, the word that we have been given, the law, the rules, they're there for our benefit. They're there to make us better. And the rejection of that is to move away from truth. And when you move into, and like when you move away from truth at all, it's nothing but illusion and lies and untruth. It's nothing but darkness when you move away from the light. And so we're cast into a state of confusion. And that's where most of us are. We're very confused these days. Nobody knows what to believe. Nobody knows which way is up. Nobody knows what's going on. You know, we don't know who to trust. We don't know who to turn to. And that's because we've tried to find that solution everywhere except the one place that we can actually find it, which is with God. He goes on to say, because they did not obey my regulations, they scorned my decrees by violating my Sabbath days and a longing for the idols of their ancestors. I gave them over to worthless decrees and regulations that would not lead to life. I let them pollute themselves with the very gifts I had given, and I allowed them to give their firstborn children as offerings to their gods, so I might devastate them and remind them that I am the Lord. So there's a lot in that. So one thing about that is the Sabbath, which is interesting because I think that that's like the one commandment that Christians these days are proud of breaking. Like they're belligerent of like, yeah, we don't keep the Sabbath. We don't have to do that anymore. It's like, why? It's like, oh, well, and the argument that I always hear is like, well, Christ abolished all that, blah, blah, blah. It's like, that's one of the 10 commandments. You're saying that went out the window. You're saying the 10 commandments went out the window. No, the Sabbath is very important. And the Sabbath, if I'm not mistaken, is the only one that's given a reason, an explanation for its presence, for its existence. Remember the Sabbath, you know, for you were once slaves in Egypt. And there's a lot there, and we probably don't have time to get into it, but there's something to be said about the fact that because you are not slaves, you need to take a day off. You need to take a day where you're not working, where you're not laboring for the world, and you're turning your focus back to God. And when you, and the way that I kind of, there's a lot of directions to go with this. I'll pick one just for the sake of time. And this one kind of occurred to me recently, is that even if you take Sundays off and you don't work on Sundays, and you say, oh, well, I'm going to go to church, I'm going to do all this, that, and the other, and that's good. But I think, at least for me, and you could probably relate to this, I still spend, or at least I was spending a lot of time on Sundays engaged in like social media and, you know, scrolling mindlessly, watching content on YouTube and whatever else, et cetera, et cetera. And it kind of occurred to me, like, this is an addiction. This is something that I am a slave to in a very real sense. Is there not something to it that if I willfully say, I don't have to take time away from the world to separate myself from it, if I don't do that, and I can't do that, I'm still a slave to the world. And so I'm not taking this day to where I'm actually just like, I don't know exactly what we're supposed to do on the Sabbath. I'll be totally honest. I don't know exactly what the limit is of like, how far can we drive? What kind of work can we do? I don't know. It's a very deep question. But I think that there is something to be said for, if there's something that controls you and there's something that you struggle with and you can't take one day a week off from it, you truly are a slave to it. And if nothing else, I feel that we should be putting our attention on like, well, let's start breaking those chains, because if that's something that I can't control, that's something that I don't exercise my authority over, then that's something that can stand between me and God. And that's something that can affect our relationship negatively. And social media is a good example of that, because if, for example, I can't stop using it, or I'm not willing to, and the content that I'm coming across is distracting me, right? It's distracting me from the voice of God, from my purpose, from the other things that I could be doing, if nothing else. And it's potentially very toxic. It's filling my brain with things that are worldly and things that are, how are things distracting to us? Well, they engage our emotions. Once the emotional brain is activated, it can only think about 5 seconds into the future. So we're stuck in this present moment of like right here, right now. And we're not thinking about the long term. We're not thinking about the transcendent. We're only thinking about what's right in front of us. What are we feeling here right now? And it does this by engaging our emotions. It makes us feel angry. It makes us feel excited. It makes us feel lustful. It makes us feel envious, whatever else. And so that's something that we are constantly being controlled and influenced by, is things of the world. Okay, so there's something to be said for the Sabbath. They're not taking the time to remind themselves that they're not slaves. Therefore, they are willfully staying as slaves, maybe not in the same sense as in Egypt, but in a sense that they are controlled by the world. They're not free from their own desires and impulses. And longing for the idols of their ancestors. Obviously, I'm going to do an episode on idols before too long. But he says, I gave them over to worthless decrees and regulations that would not lead to life. And that's kind of the essence of, the law, the vine of Jonah that sprang up to shield him from the sun, which is representative of God. And then the vine would be the law. When we can't, I try to stay on topic. When Moses went up the mountain, he went up the mountain. All the people didn't go up with him, because not everyone can approach. Like, there has to be an intermediary between us and God. When God spoke through the burning bush, he spoke through the burning bush. He didn't manifest in his full glory. Even when he spoke to Moses later on, and Moses was allowed to look on him, in some sense, he was allowed to look only on his back. And there's probably a lot of symbolism in that by itself. But again, there's like, what is that pattern of like, because it recurs over and over again, where it's not just God speaking to everybody. Like, he doesn't come down and give this message to all of the people. He gives it to a prophet. He gives it to a patriarch. He gives it to certain people, and those people are responsible for carrying that message reliably. They're responsible for treating it appropriately, respectfully, and carrying it the way that it was intended to be carried. And so when you take that away, and it's just the empty law, which is part of Jesus's ministry, it's like, look, it's not just the form, it's not just the external stuff. You're doing this without the Spirit. So you're saying, I didn't murder somebody, so I didn't sin, when in reality you have harbored anger in your heart. And so I'm telling you, you have committed murder. And it seems extreme, but the reality is that, like, the point of that law not to murder wasn't just so that you don't murder. It's also so that you don't harbor murderous intentions within you. It's also so that you stay completely out of that lane. And they weren't doing that, and we're still not doing that. We still it's ironic, because a lot of people kind of criticize the Pharisees and their interpretation of Scripture and the law, but they're still doing the same thing. They're still saying, well, I didn't do X, Y, Z, or I believe, I go to church, therefore I'm fine, whatever. And it's like, well, but your life doesn't reflect that. I gave them over to worthless decrees and regulations, because that in and of itself is not what leads to life. Those are the training wheels. Those are the guardrails that keep us on track, or that can keep us on track. But really what's leading us is the Spirit of Christ. I let them pollute themselves with the very gifts I had given them. I love that, because whenever we look at like, well, why is God destructive? And people criticize the Old Testament, like God's wrathful, all this other stuff. It's like, he gives us free will, and we choose to do despicable things with it sometimes. That doesn't mean that everybody's despicable, but it certainly is easy to see these patterns. Like, we acted out individually, but you can definitely see it in culture, especially it's magnified in a very real sense. There's, the things that we are given. So maybe you're given the gift of being a good speaker, right? But if you use that and you go into politics and you become very corrupt and you persuade people to do things that they shouldn't do for your own personal edification and glory, well, then that's a misuse of that gift. If you use it to go into sales, but you engage in unethical practices and you pressure people into getting stuff that they shouldn't, that they don't need, that that they don't need, that they can't afford, whatever, you take advantage of people, well, that's a misuse of that gift. And it's like, that was supposed to be something that God used for his kingdom and purpose, and you have squandered it and intentionally used it for something that it was not meant for. I allowed them to give their firstborn children as offerings to their gods. That was one that always surprised me. There's no way. Who's going to sacrifice their kids? But you see it now. You see people glorifying, abortion rights as like this benevolent thing. It's mass infanticide, and it's culturally acceptable. There's parades for it. So it's not actually that difficult to imagine. And we say, well, they're not offering them to gods. It's like, well, in a sense, they are. They're offering them to the gods of themselves in one interpretation of that, at least. Because why do people do that? Because it would be inconvenient for them, because it would hinder their freedom. They're not willing to shoulder the responsibility that their actions have produced. And I'm not saying that that's an easy thing to do by any means. It's not that I don't have sympathy for the people in that situation. That's not what I'm saying. But when you prioritize your personal pleasure in pursuit of gratification, your whims and desires and the way that you think things should be, when you're not able to value a human life over your own, and that can even be the way that you treat people in general. If you have your kids, but you raise them in a way that is, willfully destructive, and you don't treat them as the people that they are, you treat them as, less as your inferiors, which I mean they kind of are in a sense, but also in another sense they're not. When you say I want to live vicariously through these kids, so I'm going to make them do the things that I was too scared to do, kind of deal. And you can go on and on with that. Like I don't think it has to be a literal sacrifice to a wood or stone idol. I think that it is in this context. And I think that we can definitely see that in real culture, but it's also a metaphor for, there doesn't have to be a literal physical death, but there can be, like, I sacrifice my family, for example, to the influences of the world because I want to fit in and I want to be accepted by society. So I raise my kids in a way that fits in with that cultural narrative. I raise them in a way that allows me to virtue signal and to gain attention and glory for myself, even to the detriment of my children, for example. And yeah, that brings devastation, that brings destruction. But of course, through that is, the burning away of everything that is not holy, that is not godly, and that is not moving us in the right direction. And it brings the people back to an understanding that actually there is a higher thing. There's something transcendent. There's a higher moral code, and there's something beyond my own perception of right and wrong. And so I can't just say, well, I think things should be this way, because there's the harsh reality of life that, like, you can think that and you can act that way, but you're going to have to deal with the consequences, right? And that's something I talk about on my other podcast a lot. I won't get too far into it, but all right, we're going to wrap it up with this one right here. You will know that I am the Lord, O people of Israel, when I have honored by name by treating you mercifully in spite of your wickedness. I, the sovereign Lord, have spoken. So there's a few things going on there. One is that he wants to be merciful. He wants people to turn back and to honor him. And again, it's criticized by deconstructionists, if I'm saying that right, as, trying to ascribe human ego to God. And it's not accurate. It's not because he thinks that he's better than everybody else. He is better than everybody else. And the best thing that we can possibly attain to is to do exactly what he has ordained, because he loves us. He created us with love. And so whatever he has mandated is the best for us. And he did that very intentionally. And it may seem difficult at first. It may seem confusing, but God doesn't want our understanding. He wants our obedience. And through our obedience, he will give us understanding and wisdom. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So, yeah. And the whole point of all of this is not because, like, I'm mad at you, I'm going to destroy this stuff. And which is kind of how I read it as a kid. It's, I want to be merciful. I keep giving these opportunities. And he wouldn't be saying this through the prophets if the intention was like, I'm done. I'm just going to burn everyone to pieces. It's like the same thing with Nineveh. He sent Jonah and said, I'm going to destroy you. And then the people turned away from their wickedness and they were forgiven. They were given at least some quarter. I don't know if they turned back afterwards. Like, it doesn't really talk about it afterwards as far as I know. And so, but that is God's intention. He wants people to hear that and to develop a fear of him, a healthy fear of him, right? not terror in the sense that like we're scared to do anything because God's always watching, but the fear of acknowledging like who is God? Like this is the creator of the universe. And he has specifically told us to do certain things. And we're willfully going to go against that when we know that he can see us, when we know that he's aware of us, and we lose that sense of respect. We lose that sense of difference of, hey, I'm at the bottom of the totem pole, or well, actually, I think totem poles reverse. I'm at the bottom of this hierarchy, and I'm attaining to something higher. I'm aspiring to be better, but I'm not there, right? Like the whole idea about like you're a drop in the ocean, but you're also the ocean in a drop. It's like that's true in a very basic sense, I suppose, but you're still a drop. Like the ocean's still big, and you're still going to splatter up against the side of a ship the first time the wind blows. Like you're not powerful. You are a reflection of God, but you are not God. And so to understand, to have that fear, to have that respect, to understand that like who he is, right? And sometimes we need to be reminded of that through physical acts of nature, right? Like the violence of the world or a war, something that puts us in a state where we are actually afraid and we realize I can't rely on myself. I'm not good enough. I don't have it all figured out. And society doesn't have it figured out. The idols that I worship don't have it figured out. There's something transcendent. And you realize that in moments of distress sometimes. And I think that the cycle here is like, look, I don't want it to come to that point, but I am willing to take it to that point. And I will if you don't stop. And that's kind of the cycle that repeats over and over again. So definitely a lot of correlation between these times and our current day. People talk about end times a lot and like the patterns that are described in prophecies. I would say that the prophecies are patterns of reality, and that the end times may be the fulfillment of that pattern. That doesn't necessarily mean that because we're in that pattern that this is the end time or this is the final stage of that. It could definitely mean that, like, yes, this like we see Revelation acting itself out. We see the prophets, like the time of the prophets acting themselves out. But you could also look at what was going on in Israel during this time and realize that, like, well, it's kind of the same thing. And it may be more extreme or more exaggerated now, but it's kind of also not, because it's just we have different technology and we have different um, structures globally. It is different. It has evolved and changed, but it's the same pattern that's repeating. And we've seen how this pattern plays out. When people allow idolatry into their personal lives, they take their eyes off of God and they start to worship things of this world, not even necessarily just bowing down before something, but putting your faith in something other than God. Like, I think this president's going to save me. Silly. I think that this procedure is going to make my life better. I think that this job is going to fix things, or this person's going to fix things. I think that social media takes up too much of your attention, right? Like that isn't, these are idols. These are things that distract us. And when the culture becomes obsessed with that and then becomes the next part of the pattern, they become prideful in that. And it's not just that, like, yeah, we're doing the stuff that we shouldn't be doing, but now it's like, it's just an open thing. It's shameless. And then the pride seeps in. It's like, well, when the pride seeps in is when you start to really have to take corrective action, because when somebody knows that they're failing and they're trying to do better, that's a little bit different than somebody who knows it's wrong and just doesn't care. And that's what you see. You see pride everywhere. You see open acceptance and encouragement of the most degenerate behavior imaginable. And you see the willful blindness to it by people that should be doing something to stop it. You see the active engagement with a huge portion of our society, and if nothing else, the evil of omission. Well, I'm just going to go along with it because I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I don't want to ruffle feathers. I don't want them to feel like I don't agree with them, whatever. And it's very dangerous. And a big point of the prophets is like, look, you guys are going to be destroyed. The righteous will not be. They're still going to suffer because they're here, but they will be saved. And so make sure that you're on the right side of that when it happens. Understand that this is a pattern that repeats itself and is something to be aware of. We're not going to get it right. We're not going to be perfect. And that's okay. Like, we do have that mercy. We do have that forgiveness. And God says again and again, I will be merciful if you let me. But I can't be merciful for somebody who's not repentant, who's not trying to come back to me, who's not admitting that they are in the wrong, because like you have that free will. So I'm not going to force you to come to me. You have to choose to come to me. So make that decision. You guys, if you enjoyed this, make sure you like and subscribe. Hit that little 5-star review if you're on Spotify. And yeah, I'll see you soon. Peace be with you.